Hello and welcome now as we come to the 30th Sunday of the year. And for our scripture readings, the first comes from the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 7 through 9. From the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. And from the gospel tradition of Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. Now, this week, and keep in mind that what we have been looking at, hopefully throughout these discussions, is the overview of the gospel tradition according to Mark. And what we come to today is the end, in the reading that we have, of the journey that Jesus had begun. One remembers a few chapters ago, from Caesarea Philippi, had started a kind of wayward journey down to Jerusalem. What we will find today is that finally Jesus comes to the entrance city or portal to the great city of Jerusalem. This journey has been characterized by, remember, Jesus giving 3 predictions about what is going to occur when they come to Jerusalem with regard to him and to his future. We have seen the different ways in which the disciples have heard that message or not listened too carefully to it and have responded to it. Now, one of the characteristics of the gospel tradition according to Mark is the use of what we would call bookends or brackets. And today, we come to the second, or to the bracket that concludes this journey theme. How did it begin? It had begun by Jesus healing a blind person. And that had been described as Jesus being a very traditional healer, using the usual procedures of spittle and bottle, etc., in order to heal the blind man. This week, we come to another blind man. And so what it looks like Mark has done is used 2 blind men as kind of the bookends for the material that we have been looking at over the last few weeks. So we begin by that there is a stylistic development that is very much one used by Mark, and we have seen this. He likes this bookending technique. We saw it a number of other times. Perhaps the most popular you remember was when, with regard to the curing of Jairus' daughter, that Jairus had come to Jesus, asked that his daughter be healed. He had then started out toward Jairus' house. In between had come a woman who was suffering from hemorrhaging, had been cured by Jesus, and then the journey to Jairus' house had continued, and so that Jairus story had bookend, if you want, the centering story about the healing of the woman with the hemorrhaging. So I just review that a little bit as one of the stylistic techniques that Mark uses. All right, so this time, as the journey continues from last week, we have been pretty closely following verse by verse of chapter 10 of Mark's story. Comes now, well, in fact, is pictured as passing out of the city of Jericho. Now, Jericho, of course, is a very important city. Certainly, one remembers, well, a couple of little background details about Jericho while we're kind of having the opportunity here. Jericho was located 15 miles northeast of Jerusalem. It was 5 miles west of the Jordan River, and it was 6 miles north of the Dead Sea. Now, its location, therefore, that would be kind of the geographic situation. What we know is that there had been settlements in the city of Jericho Surviving buildings have been discovered by archaeologists which date back to 9,000 BCE. So it was a very popular place for settlement. The city of Jericho, or the location of Jericho, is 825 feet below sea level, making it one of the lowest parts of our planet. So what that would do is keep the climate there generally very mild, sometimes even hot, depending on the season of the year. The oldest settlement at Jericho that was discovered dated to about the 6th century before the common time, and that had been established by the Babylonians, who invaded the area. But what we have also noticed here, and we are indebted here, it was the site of one of the most famous archaeologists of the early late 30s, of the early 40s, was Catherine Kenyon, who was an English archaeologist who in many ways perfected the style of archaeology that was taking place. We may have mentioned this before, but archaeology, of course, has given us often a window into the past, not to great things, but usually to ordinary things that were discovered and dug up. What we often find is what we might call the garbage of the past, but those would be things that people used and therefore give us a kind of interesting indication of what life was like in those days. Kenyon, who perfected archaeology, changed the method of archaeology from the first way that it had been done. Particularly the first archaeologist had done work at Troy, up in Asia Minor or Turkey, one of the most popular archaeological sites even to this day, but had been done by what we would call pick and axe. Namely, they would come to a site which they thought was the place indicated either in the scripture or in some other writing, and would dig away and shovel off the dirt that they found. Now she said, wait a minute, often what they were doing was destroying evidence unconsciously in this method. And so she went back, or developed rather, the pattern that is now used of where they use sieves, and they take every little bit of the ground or earth that they are doing and sift it through to make sure that they don't lose any evidence that might be buried on that particular site. So her technique for doing archaeological research or digs today, they are those who engage in archaeology indebted to her. Now also at the site of Jericho, and you have to kind of appreciate how this process of archaeological digs work, estimate that there may have been as many as 7 different cities built at Jericho. Now we've noticed before that when cities expanded or developed, they didn't do the process that we do. When a city wants to grow or expand, it moves to the suburbs. I mean, we kind of see this as the modern way in which many of our cities do, and some of the suburbs become, yes, indirectly connected with the city itself, but then develop their own identity. But in the ancient world, when you wanted to rebuild something, what you did was level the existing place, bury it, level it off, bury it under, put some kind of ground or dirt on top of it, and then build the new city or the new place. Now, the advantage to that to archaeologists is that as they begin to dig at these places, they realize there may be another level underneath and continue to go down and sometimes discover that. So all of that is a little bit of describing the importance of Jericho. Now, other reasons why Jericho was important, of course, goes to the book of Joshua in the Hebrew Bible or our Old Testament, where you remember when the Israelites came out of the years of wilderness, Moses had died. He had passed on the leadership of the Israelite people to Joshua. They had crossed the Jordan River. There had been a kind of interesting event took place there, and came now to the city of Jericho. And of course, everyone remembers the famous story that the Israelites took the city of Jericho. The walls of Jericho came tumbling down when the Israelites had circled it, shouted, blown their horn, and taken it. So Jericho, therefore, became the entrance city of Israel to the land of Canaan. Now keep in mind, what Mark is patterning is that Jericho now becomes the entrance city of Jerusalem of Jericho to Jerusalem. So notice, some parallels that are being developed here by the Gospel Mark. He is very alert to many of these kind of things. One final thought about Jericho is that because of its weather, because of its mild winters, many of those who were in good positions or wealthy built homes in Jericho to spend the winter, especially since in Jerusalem, because of its height, could get cold. Not that it snowed there once in a great while, it snowed, but it could get pretty cold, and cold would be in the 30s or even sometimes a little bit lower. Therefore, moved for the winter down to Jericho because of its milder climate. Much, I suspect, like some people in our neck of the woods moved to Florida in the winter because the weather is nicer there. That's an odious comparison, but nevertheless, you get the idea of how this worked. And so we also think that Herod the Great had built a palace down in Jericho, that now whether he used it or not, but nevertheless it was designed for that purpose. And it may have been that Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, who, remember, ruled the territory of the Galilee, may also have had a residence there. So all of that is a little bit of a background to the importance of the city of Jericho, both geographically and in terms of the literature or the theology that Mark is presenting. All right, so as Jesus is pictured now as leaving the city of Jericho, the other evangelists, Matthew and Luke, will tell stories about what Jesus did in the city of Jericho. However, Mark does not do that. So we really don't know what he did in Jericho or how long it took him to pass through. Only that as he is, and this is what the text of Mark says, as he was leaving Jerusalem, a man named Bartimaeus, and we only know that he is the son of Timaeus. That we don't know very much about either, but we do know his name, because in other instances, when Jesus is curing folks, their name is not always given. Now, Bartimaeus is described as blind, and he is a blind beggar. Now, blindness, we certainly have seen this before, was very common in the ancient Middle East. And it was due to trichonema, which was a contagious infection of the inner ear, or the mucus, living in the eyelids of the cornea. Now we know all of this, and we know that it was often transmitted by flies and poor hygiene. So unlike other diseases, this was considered to be contagious. Now, while you thought, well, if they simply had washed their hands a little bit, they could have prevented some of this. But keep in mind that water was a bit scarce. Even though Jericho might have had more of it, nevertheless. So hygiene was often one of the reasons why this illness of the eye took place. It's also mentioned that Bartimaeus had sight. So his blindness was not from birth, but somewhere along the line he had become blind, and he was a beggar. Now, a last point about blindness, and we see this in other occasions, that some argued that the real reason why a person became blind was that he had done something displeasing to God, and that this was God's way of kind of, retribution or punishment. Why? That somehow the person had sinned. On other occasions, however, Jesus violently, maybe the wrong word, but strongly argues that that is not the reason why blindness occurred. It is not that God is using this as a vehicle for kind of getting back at people for doing something that they shouldn't have. But nevertheless, that thought was and is sometimes lost. All right. Bartimaeus is presented as a beggar, but he is presented as a very shrewd man. Now, what he does, apparently he has heard the reputation of Jesus. How he heard this? Well, perhaps as they are journeying down to Jericho, the story of what he has been doing has been told, or even while he was in Jericho, perhaps stories were told. However that happens, Bartimaeus has heard about this, and he calls out to Jesus, calling him the Son of David. Son of David, have mercy on me. He shouts loud enough so that Jesus can hear him over, apparently, a group of people who are surrounding Jesus and following him. Now, why is this Son of David title important? Because, and this is the first time, by the way, that this title is attributed to Jesus in this gospel, but because Son of David connects Jesus certainly with David and also with Solomon, who was, you remember, the son of David. Calls upon him, by the way, not just once, but a number of times, to put Jesus on the spot, as it were. That's why we're saying that this man is kind of shrewd, because he says, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now, mercy, of course, is the quality that is frequently given. Now, mercy is described as a person's willingness to pay a personal debt. So keep in mind, mercy may not simply be seen as, well, you're beating up someone and they say, have mercy. No, there's a much deeper understanding of this quality here. And so in the Mediterranean value system, mercy describes a person's willingness to pay a personal debt. Now, what is the debt that Jesus might be owed to this man? The fact that he has called him the Son of David, that he has publicly praised him, and the crowd certainly have heard this. So notice that even in listening to this gospel, sound or voice is important. We don't know exactly the distance that the beggar is from the passage of Jesus on the way out of Jericho, but we do know that it was enough that he had to call somewhat loudly. And he calls him Son of David, calls him, by the way, my master. Now, it's interesting that this word, Rabboni, is not used in this gospel except here. The only other place it is used is in the Gospel of John, where Mary Magdalene speaks of Jesus as my master. So, again, it is a term that is unique, yet important in the tradition of Israel at the time. Now, he has publicly, that is, the blind beggar, has publicly identified Jesus as Messiah. Now, keep in mind that that's what this whole journey has been about. Jesus had been proclaimed, you remember, as it began by asking his disciples, who do people say that I am? And Peter had said, you are the Messiah, the Christ. And as the journey had developed, Jesus tried to help his disciples appreciate what title Messiah meant to Jesus. It did not mean what many of them had perceived or hoped that it might be. We've discussed this on certainly a number of occasions. But now the beggar praises Jesus as the Messiah, as the Son of David, and given him the honor publicly of being recognized as the Messiah. It's very difficult here for Jesus to accept something, a title like this, honor, without kind of having put himself in debt. Now, it's a very clever device here, one that we probably would not have totally appreciated. Jesus here, and you remember, why do I say I was going to say, Jesus calls him 3 times to come. Now, remember that the crowd, whoever they were, whoever made it up, had told the blind man, stop it, stop calling, okay? And that had only encouraged him to do it more. And so they had been kind of, pushing him away from Jesus, much as earlier on the disciples had tried to push children away. Remember that they felt they had to protect Jesus or something like that. But he only persists the more or the louder. So you can only imagine that as he calls out, perhaps the tone of his voice got a little bit longer too. Anyway, Jesus says, bring him, let him come to me. So he comes to him, and Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? Now, those were the very same words, if you go back last time, to he addressed, that is, Jesus addressed to James and John. What do you want me to do for you? Well, he obviously says that I might see. Now, what happens is that the man's sight is restored. Again, as we have mentioned, he had seen before, so it wasn't like an earlier cure back at Bethsaida, as we mentioned in chapter 8, where he had cured a blind man from birth. Now here is one where his sight is restored, and he has overcome blindness. Now, here's where different levels of interpretation might come into play. What kind of blindness have the disciples had as they have been making this journey? Had been spiritual blindness. Now, this man receives, physical blindness, but what he does immediately is he follows after Jesus. So the blind man here now becomes, in Mark's story, a model of discipleship and of faith. He now follows Jesus, and we don't know what happens to him. Nothing in the gospel further explains, a story about him. But Jesus has answered his request, and his request had been that I may see again. And hopefully the disciples would see again what Jesus had been talking about and hoping that they would understand. Another little characteristic in this story is that when Jesus calls Bartimaeus to himself, he gets up, throws off his outer garment or his cloak. Now, a number of interpretations have also been made about that action. One of them would be, he is now going to change his whole attitude, and it's going to be a spiritual healing or helping, and so he throws off his garment. But another, more practical, is we don't know where this beggar lived, but we do know that if he lived at night, that the outer garment really became, what do you want? His house almost, what kept him warm during the evening hours. By throwing it off, by getting up and coming to Jesus, he is really showing a tremendous act of faith. And so again, this seems to be one of those values that is at work here, that somehow whatever it is that Jesus can do, he will do for him, and he will not need this cloak anymore for that reason. So you see, a lot is at work here in this interesting concluding story, as now they will begin the journey up to the city of Jerusalem. As we have mentioned on other occasions, it was the typical road on the way to Jerusalem. What do you want me to do for you? Of course, as I say, echoes what had been said earlier on. In this case, the James and John had asked inappropriately for something. The blind man asks appropriately and faithfully for something, namely the healing that he might see. So all of that, there's a lot going on in this little story, as you can see, little bits and pieces, the whole location of the place, the situation of blindness, the beggar's very shrewdness, as I said earlier on, by challenging the honor of Jesus, by publicly honoring him, he puts Jesus in debt. So Jesus repays the debt. Now, it certainly would probably not be the way in which we would, I think of doing this or looking at this. But he insists that Jesus owes healing to him by shouting. You see? So he uses his voice, very clever beggar here, to make the crowd aware. See, so his shouting, what does it do? It puts Jesus in a good light. Jesus, Son of David. So notice that's why I called him kind of shrewd, kind of clever in his whole approach to Jesus. So that's the concluding story of the journey. The first reading, by the way, comes from our popular prophet Jeremiah. from what is one of the sections of the book of Jeremiah called the Book of Consolation, which is chapters 30 to 33. And in this little section that we hear, where Jeremiah tells the remnant of Israel, those who had been driven out of the Holy Land earlier on, that they would be brought back from the land that they were in exile across a fertile crescent to a restored and renewed Jerusalem. Keep in mind, of course, fertile crescent means that you had water, and all of that, of course, in a little way is important. So the city of Jericho today is one of the more interesting sites, and from there, the ascent of Jesus, and we will pick up now what happens in our next episode when Jesus is in Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.